The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Getting to Know You. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Maeve McEneny. She is the program coordinator at the Albany County Convention and Visitors Bureau. She also runs the education programs for students. So welcome, Maeve.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're not going to be really talking about the Albany County Convention and Visitor Center, maybe a little, but we're here to talk about ghosts and haunted houses of the Capital Region. And when I was doing some research here, Maeve, I was going to write down the ones you sent me: Brook Mansion, the Capitol, the State Education Building. But I got this list here. Let me just read some of these. I didn't know there was so many in our area where there's, I guess you could say, ghosts, or they're haunted, or there's stuff going on at night. We got the New York State Education Building, the Brook Mansion, the Capitol, the Legs Diamond House, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Building, the Lincoln Park Gully, I assume that's down there. Okay. Cherry Hill Mansion, both Sage and St. Rose, the Loudon Cottage, Albany Rural Cemetery, and then over in Troy, or Rensselaer County, we got West Hall over at RPI, Snyder's Lake. Then back over this way, the Community Reformed Church of Colonie, and on and on. This went on for like 30 pages.
Yes, so we're only scratching the surface with that list.
We obviously won't get to all these, but why don't you tell me a little bit about, you used to do some of the tours they have at the Capitol, where the ghost is mentioned, and some others. Just why don't we start there?
Yeah, actually, my roots in this go even further than that. Is my father, we mentioned, Albany historian, and he would bring me around the city of Albany as a young child, pointing out these old buildings, and of course, as a child, couldn't be more boring, right? I had no interest.
Some of the ones I just named.
Oh, yeah, you know, when you're 10 to 12, it's hard to engage, but he was picking this up, and he'd go, well, do you know that building's haunted? And then as a child, I'd say, oh, well, tell me more. And who are those people? And I would start asking the history questions. So it really was the gateway to get me interested in history.
Oh, okay.
And then as a child, I said, there should be a tour about this. So the Albany Aqueducts hired me. I wrote the first Albany Ghost Tour. We call it the original Albany Ghost Tour.
And how many spots or stops were on that first one?
We would start at the Albany Visitor Center, go to Brook, the Capitol, and to Graceland Cemetery to see Hattie the Hitchhiker.
Okay.
And then the New York State Capitol, I was a tour guide there, and I would give tours, the ghost tours there, and they are opened up for ghost tours right now. And and now pretty much I go wherever the hauntings call me.
I see. So what do you think? Before we talk about some specific ones, just what do you think about? Why do you think this persists? That people think certain houses or places are haunted, and there may be ghosts there.
Well, it's really our region, and for people, because there are people who love the paranormal, we're actually part of the the Haunted History Trail, which is a statewide trail of ghosts. And Albany is the oldest chartered city in the United States. But let's take our story back to 1609 with Henry Hudson and coming here. And when you walk around the city, you're walking on the remnants of that old Albany. I mean, any kind of digging we do, you're going to find artifacts from those old Dutch. So I think that's a big thing, is we're really old. And what's really good for a ghost story, I mean, very rarely do you go to a new building and say, it's haunted. No, generally the story's old. So not only are we one of the oldest, so that means that there's that just idea, there's more stories to tell.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Like I say, my list here of just the Capital Region went on for it was like 30 pages.
Yeah. So we have a really deep breadth of history, and especially in our Capital Region. So I think that's really what it is.
So what do you? Why don't we talk about a few, and then maybe you can mention maybe what makes a good ghost story or haunting.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't know. What's Tenbrook Mansion is pretty famous.
Yeah.
And what's the well? Is there a couple?
Oh,
ghosts
there are many.
All right.
Ghosts.
So let's just
There
start.
are many ghosts at the Tenbrook Mansion, and now we can even modernize these stories a little bit because, especially with the popularity of the ghost hunting shows, where they bring in the gadgets and all of that. So Tenbrook Mansion invited a group called Tri-City New York Paranormal, and they came with all of those gadgets you see on the Ghost show. That was in 2012.
Where they actually try to measure or get on camera or tape?
All of it. So
Okay.
they used photography. They used what's called electronic voice phenomenon, which
Yeah.
is think of radio static, and then you catch ghost voices. And reading just even how temperature spikes, where you'll be in a room that's normally sort of comfortable like this, and all of a sudden you can see your breath. And they'll have a gadget that's showing you that.
No. When they did this, were you there when they did this?
I was not, but I was there for the presentation.
Okay.
And they revealed a lot of these things. But the most interesting to me was they showed a picture of a woman in white. So they looked in the window, and there's this smoky, misty figure that looks like a woman. And skeptics, you can look at it and say, well, maybe it's dust and maybe it's a smudge. Well, there was a strange hush that went over the crowd. And at the end of the presentation, people started raising their hand. And it turned out that the crowd was made up of people who were residents of the Tenbrook Triangle, or their grandparents were. And it started to go through this line of people going, I've seen her, or my grandmother saw her. And I even found out my cousin, and he didn't know I did ghost tours, but I was sort of telling the story. He goes, oh yes, I know who she was. When I was an Albany police officer, 2 police officers showed up on the grounds, saw the woman in the window, and out they ran. So what I'm really interested in is taking these folklore stories, these stories we pass along, and it's kind of fun to add the modern hook of the ghost hunters, but it's a great gateway to get to our
So
history.
just, I have going back to
Sure.
that. When the ghost hunters were measuring and recording, there was actually people just sitting and watching or listening, or were they?
So they did a study by themselves. So they have a group of them who, of course, would go at midnight, 3 a.m. Obviously, that's the best time. And they did a couple weekends of studying there. And then they did a presentation for the neighborhood.
Let's see, now, do ghosts ever come out during the day? Is that?
So I would say yes, because my story that I have is when I was doing tours in the mansion, and I was told if you're alone and it's creepy, talk to the house.
This is Tenbrook Mansion.
This is at Tenbrook, and so it was the last day of my tours, and I said, okay, it's my last tour here, and that grandfather clock door opened wide. As soon as I said, okay, it's my last tour, it was broad daylight, and I was almost out the door.
See, you're getting me scared now.
I yelled you.
So the Tenbrook Mansion is, as far as these other ones I mentioned, is this sort of one of the more, I don't know, famous or infamous ones?
I would say the woman in white
who
is
is
not. So who is the woman in
Yeah.
white? This is a project that I'm working on right now. We don't know who the woman in white is, but I use her as a figure to why is she always looking out the window? Like, what was Tenbrook Mansion like? It was opened in 1798. Right now it's in Arbor Hill, but when the Tenbrooks built it, it overlooked the river. It was on a
Okay.
suburb on a hill, and it would have overlooked the river. So you see her there, you have to think she might wake up in the morning, and that gives you a view of what Albany would have been.
Oh, I
Or
see.
she looks to the back, and you see all the pastures and the farmland.
Okay.
Women in white are really common tropes in folklore and these stories. Everybody has a woman in white, of these women who seem to be almost stuck in a loop. Maybe they're checking on children, or they're going up and down stairs. Sometimes, because if we want a creepier ghost story, they're reliving the trauma, whether it was a murder or something like that. So women in white are a really great kernel for a folklore story.
And another thing about ghosts, do they always stay at their place, or would the woman in white go somewhere else and come back? Or they just stay
There are
there?
2 theories. You can either haunt a building
Yeah.
or you haunt a person.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And there's some people who believe that why you don't want to mess with some of this stuff is that a spirit could become attached to you and follow you home.
All right. So you gave tours at the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Now the Capitol has a couple.
The Capitol has
Stories
a
of
couple.
ghosts.
One of the most common stories is of Sam Abbott. Now, people who have been around the region for a while may also hear this spirit known as George, because before we started really doing research onto what this entity could be, people in the Capitol just called him George. So Stuart Lehman is the author of the Capitol Ghost Tour, and Stuart Lehman starts looking at 1911, the fire of 1911, and there was a horrible fire in the state capitol building. Luckily, it was really in the early mornings, late at night, early mornings, so very few people to evacuate. But the old Civil War veteran, Sam Abbott, who was the night watchman, did perish in the fire.
Okay.
Now, since then, you get sort of those classic hauntings, doors opening and closing when there's nobody around, the sound of keys going up and down the hall. You turn the corner.
Now, when do people hear these? Like people that just happen to be there alone at night?
Yeah, and then that's the thing is people say, well, who's really hanging around the Capitol at 1 o'clock in the morning? Budget season, right? So it's actually very common for people to be in the building past midnight.
Oh, okay.
Now, one of my favorite stories, and again, it's one that I heard as a child, and then when I was a tour guide there, I met the people and they confirmed the story. The Capitol's known for these beautiful Minton tiles, and they're piece by piece put together like a puzzle. Gorgeous. They were doing restoration of the building, and they're setting up the tiles, and wouldn't you know, one of the teeny tiny pieces is missing. So the maintenance...
You mean they discovered this when they were...
When they were doing it. So
Oh,
they're
okay.
they're laying all the new restored
All right.
pieces, and they're missing a tile. So they desperately go looking for it. They can't find it, and one of them, just thinking they're funny, goes, "Sam, I'm gonna need your help." And they didn't really leave the room. They went to the doorway, but nobody would have been able to get in and out. They go, "Okay, we'll just have to admit that we messed up." So they go to turn off the lights, and the tile was right in the middle of the floor.
And they, okay. And you talked to people that were there, not
Yes,
not
so
secondhand.
So I heard that as a kid.
Okay.
And then as a tour guide, I ran into one of the guys there, and I said, "Do you know?" He goes, "I was there.
Okay.
I saw that."
All right.
So-
geez. So now we'll stay in Albany for a bit
Yeah,
here. Now the New York State Education Building, which is a gigantic cavernous, I think I had a job once in when the library used to be there.
Yeah.
Way in the cellar, they had these, it was a big cavernous stacks of books and everything, but
Yeah.
it's a gigantic building. What is there? One ghost, two, or is it? What's
So there's one ghost, and this is one of those folklore stories that sort of lends to some of the climate that might have been going on in Albany, where when they were first building the education building, which I believe is 19. So it's 1908, I believe, is when construction started. It opens in 1912. And there is a Irish foreman, and he's got Italian stoneworkers. And they're pouring the cement, and for whatever reason, something happened. One of the workers falls into the cement. And everybody goes to stop the machine. They're going to try to save him, but if they did that, it would have hardened. They would have had to do all of this work. So the Irish foreman lifts his hand and says, "Keep pouring." And the legend goes is that they buried this figure. Now, that's a folklore story, because if you try to go back to these documents, it's hard to find.
if
Did
that
something
really
like that happen? But people do believe there is an entity they don't call it the basement, they call it the dungeon. And that is true. If you go to the State Education Building, where all of the archives are, it's called the dungeon. And there is a presence that people report, a sort of sad entity. You go down, you can feel your moods really shift. In a cold, we talked about how sometimes you get that feeling of coldness. So that's a story where people have reported the presence, and a story has sort of evolved around
what do
that.
you think, because folklore are supposedly based on, there's maybe something true, what would have where do you think that story would have come from if it actually didn't happen?
So I think
Or it might have happened.
I think it's one of those stories. It's the Italian
Irish.
versus
Yeah.
Irish, right? I think all of these have a lesson of some kind. Where Hattie the Hitchhiker is one I think we
Okay,
might have
yeah.
talked about, and that's in Graceland Cemetery. It's a story that I heard without knowing it was about Albany, about a beautiful girl in a prom dress who has her thumb, sticking out late at night, cold, midnight, and a kind gentleman picks her up, and he asks her name. She's Hattie. She lives on the corner of Delaware and Madison, and she just wants to go home. She's shivering. He puts his coat around her. He watches her go into the building, and he really wants to meet her. He was really smitten with her, so he goes back the next day, all dressed to impress, and when he opens the door, an old lady says, "I don't have a daughter, what do you mean?" And he explains the story, and of course the single tear goes down her cheek, and she goes, "Well, I did have a daughter named Hattie, but she was killed by a drunk driver, and you brought her home." So he's driving back, he's very shook by this, and he starts to go by Graceland again, and for whatever reason he pulls in, he decides to walk to the stones, and sure enough he finds a gravestone with her name with a coat draped over the gravestone. That coat is his. Now, what's that story about? Well, that's a warning of drunk driving,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
She's another woman in white, killed innocently, reliving this trauma. So I think a lot of them have lessons. Now, then you get into some other drearier stories, about the warnings of parking, where we
Yeah.
start getting, when later in the 80s, we start getting more into the escaped serial killers who go after young couples in cars. So you can see how these stories evolve and what lessons we want to tell.
So, and then you told me before we started, you gave a tour or talk or whatever
Yeah.
at West Hall at RPI.
Yeah.
That's the, if you know Troy, it's right, they're building the first one over the overlook, the
Yeah.
walk, what's that called?
I think they called it the Overlook, I believe so, yeah.
The stone walkway, but that first building, it's
Yeah.
the old Catholic High.
It's the old Catholic. That's
Okay.
really the way to get people,
All
right,
right,
it's the old Catholic.
it's got the stairs in front.
It's got the stairs. It still has the old boys and
Yeah.
girls entrance,
Okay,
which
so
is
what's
really cool.
What is the ghost?
So that's Nurse Betsy, and Nurse Betsy is, because it was at one point
It was a hospital,
hospital.
yeah.
So before it was Catholic High, it was a hospital, and it did have veterans who stayed there. Now, this is a classic folklore story because depending on who you ask, they will say, "I know that story really well," and it'll be completely different from the person next to them and to next to them. But the traditional story is that she was a nurse in the hospital, in the Troy Hospital, and there was a fire in the Troy Hospital, and she perished. Where the story begins to deviate is she good or is she evil? So depending on what colorful college student's telling it, is that she used to torture the insane patients, and so she's there today and scaring people and turning off the lights and shattering light bulbs, or is she kind? Where some of these patients, and you think about PTSD was a very real thing and not understood, and they say she was kind, and that she used to, sometimes people report hearing piano music in the building, and when nobody's around. And the building is now used as the arts building, so there is a piano there, but when people investigate, there's nobody there. So that's Nurse Betsy, but she's a classic folklore story.
Now, have the ghost hunters with their equipment ever gone to the West Hall?
We will be.
Oh, when is
Actually, so there'll be a November reveal on that. But one of the most famous ghost hunters, whose name I'm forgetting, but viewers who have watched The Conjuring, it's Lorraine, and I'm forgetting their last name, but they were one of the most famous ghost hunters, and they created this new movie called The Conjuring, and they did investigate West Hall many, many years ago.
But you're saying they're going to come to West Hall?
So there's going to be an official investigation with a reveal in November, but that's all I can tell you right now. So
Okay. Now, what about my list is so long. Let me just, because everyone knows this building is so huge. The Delaware and Hudson Railroad building.
So that's a story I have heard, and it's a funny story. I feel like it's a story where some of these hauntings of older buildings, but they've been renovated over the years, and so a skeptic says, well, I don't, how would they know to use those stairs? So the story I heard with the Delaware and Hudson building is that there's a woman, classic woman with the parasol, and she walks the halls, but because they've done renovations on the floors, that she's split in half, so you only see her feet.
Oh, okay.
So that's one I think is
But people actually report seeing feet. Is that what?
yeah, so they'll see the feet, and then her other half is a floor above. So that's the one that I've heard. So I feel like that's one for somebody who is a skeptic and says, well, how would she know? We redid that floor. Well, that would be why.
Now I'll go to the obvious, because it
Yeah.
seems obvious that there would be ghosts in cemeteries, which we haven't
Yeah.
talked about. But on the list here, I don't know how many stories are associated with Albany Rural Cemetery. Are there stories for?
Not that I've heard,
Okay.
but you know what's nice. The one thing about cemeteries, and I've brought people through on ghost tours with cemeteries, is we get this creepy feeling with them.
Yes.
But anytime I've brought people in, you know, we've gone to haunted houses where people feel scared. We go to a cemetery even at night, and we don't feel scared. And when you know, like an Albany Rural Cemetery, Victorians, they were created to be parks.
That's
And
right,
the-
yeah.
Yeah, and
They have the pond up there?
they've got a pond, and the idea was is you would go to Sunday Mass and you'd have lunch with Grandma, even though Grandma's been dead for
Yeah,
15
but they would
years.
also upkeep the grounds.
Yeah.
It was like a Sunday outing.
Right.
All
So,
right.
so the thing about cemeteries, which I always try to demystify, is that they're a welcoming place. They're a warm place, believe it or not. It's where we go to share our favorite memories. And yeah, that was the idea of an Albany Rural Cemetery.
Now that you say that, it makes sense.
Yeah, next time you go and you'll see the people jogging and people walking the dogs, you'll say, this is what it was made for.
See, although, before you started, I mentioned I was from Troy, and I
Yeah.
went to a very famous, supposedly haunted cemetery, is
Yeah.
Pinewood Cemetery. And I think, what did you say about it?
It's the gateway to hell. It is the gateway to hell. And there is an angel statue who somewhere along the way lost her head. And it is closed to the public because too many people were going in there and
Really?
starting trouble. So you can't go in there without a tour guide now. But there's a moss that comes from her neck that they report turns reddish. You wash it away, and it always comes back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Nope.
okay. So, of all these stories, and you've given tours,
Yeah.
do you have I don't know, do you have like a favorite, or do you have one that you like trying to investigate more about it, that you feel?
Well, we talked about women in white. That's my new thing now, is figuring out these women and what's our fascination with them. I do love in the New York State Capitol building. We talked about Sam Abbott. There's a possible other ghost that we haven't confirmed. But if you've taken the hauntings tour of the Capitol, which does happen all October, 12:30 and 5:30, I believe, is you go into the New York State the New York State Assembly chamber, and it's the largest room in the building. You look up at the ceiling, and that's the third ceiling. The original ceiling was, when it first opened, was this tall, giant, vaulted ceiling, which was considered one of the tallest attempted in the world. Attempted.
At the time, yeah.
At the
Oh, at the
time,
time.
yeah, and it had murals painted by a man named William Morris Hunt. Well, the building began to shift, the ceiling begins to crack, we have to cover the murals. And unfortunately, the murals are hidden, still there, but we don't have a way to save them. They are,
Okay.
we had ghost hunters there, and the ghost hunters,
Up in the ceiling?
no, well, everywhere, in the
Okay.
Capitol. They did an investigation many, many years ago. And they did that EVP, that voice I was saying.
Okay.
And it said, William Morris is behind the door. Now, William Morris Hunt died under mysterious circumstances. He was very ill, and not long after he realized they had to cover the murals, he did pass away mysteriously. He drowned.
In Albany?
Not in Albany.
Okay.
So, but say, well, maybe it's the artist trying to get us to find the lost murals. But my theory is when they were dropping the ceiling for that second ceiling, a man named Cormac McWilliams was working on it on a Friday, and everyone's tired. He says, well, go home. I'll finish up. I'll see you all Monday. And they found Cormac on the floor, and it took him, he had fallen.
Oh.
And it had taken him months to die from that fall. His stone is in Albany Rural. Some people, when you first go in, it's a brown stone that looks like a tree cut in half, which some think might be made of Capitol stone. That hasn't been confirmed.
Now, which entrance?
I know it's the main entrance from Menands. That's the
Okay,
one I know.
okay.
So is it possibly Cormac, who is the one who was trapped from the trauma. We say, why do they haunt? Sometimes they say it's the trauma that traps you. So perhaps he's there trying to get us to look at what the EVP says. William Morris is behind the door. See his murals before they go. But I like that story because Cormac is my cousin.
Well,
So I like to think that maybe that's my Victorian cousin.
Well, one common thing, now that you've mentioned all these
Yeah.
stories, it seems like all these ghosts, there's an attempt to convey something.
Yeah.
But we don't know what. It could be.
Exactly. We don't know what. Is it are they stuck in the loop?
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
women in white seem to be stuck in a loop, and a lot of times they don't care. You see them and they're like, you're in my way. Like I gotta check on the house. And sometimes it is trying to reach out, to get us to change things or to stop changing things.
Okay.
We've had that at Brook Mansion where their EVPs say, go away, which, if all these tourists are coming in and messing with their stuff.
Well, stories are always meant to convey or to tell a message. Or
As we said, there's a lesson.
so now you have an event on.
Yeah.
It's a pub crawl, but a ghost pub crawl.
There is. We're doing a haunted pub crawl.
Haunted pub crawl.
A haunted pub crawl, and it's a collaboration with Albany County Historical Association and Historic Albany Foundation. We're starting in Brook Mansion, and we're going to visit McGeary's, we're going to visit Old English Pub and the Hollow Bar, but along the way we'll be telling some of these stories that you heard today, ghost stories, local
So there's no
legends.
actually haunted pubs, though.
Well, Old English Pub might beg to differ with you. That much I can say. McGeary's would beg to differ with you.
So you're going to be, and when is this event?
So those are going to be on the 25th and the 29th, and you can...
Of October.
Of October. That's a Tuesday and a Thursday, I believe.
Okay.
And you can go on Historic Albany Foundation's website, and any haunting events, because there's so much going on in our region, as you can hear, on albany.org, we have a list of all the Halloween happenings, which include the pub crawl, Cherry Hill we didn't talk about, the murder at Cherry Hill.
Yes, that's a very famous.
That's a very famous murder, and they walk you through what happened that night and sort of put it to you whether it's haunted or not. So albany.org, there's just so much in our region that we love to talk about.
And then, how are you going to be going around in the pub? You got the trolley or something?
Oh no, we'll be on foot with this one.
Oh, on foot. You'll be
We will
walking.
be, we'll be on foot.
That's why you can walk. I'm trying to think. You can
Oh,
walk,
yeah.
You can walk to all three. Okay.
Yeah, we did it last year, and we had a lot of fun. And it's great because this is my whole philosophy with these ghost tours is when you hear the word history, it's intimidating. Oh, but ghost stories I can do.
But you can learn history.
And when we learn history, so they're coming to the Brook Mansion for the first time. We give them a taste, and we have seen that people do come back. We have a guest book, and they say in the summertime, "Why are you here?" Well, I took a ghost tour.
And they come back for other events.
And they'll come back for other events. So for me, these ghost tours are great because they're a little less intimidating, but it gets you asking those questions and find out more.
And it gets you out and about.
And you get out and about.
And you can.
And pubs, right?
And you can have a beer.
Yeah, and you get a beer, and that's that we do. The drinks are not included, so you see.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, thanks. That sounds very interesting, and thanks for the update. These stories they're very interesting, they're very fascinating.
Great.
The website will be on the page here. So Maeve McEneny, thank you.
You're welcome anytime.
And we'll see you next time on Getting to Know You.